It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
Buongiorno tutti. Hello everybody, this is Phil Ferguson and you are listening to the cleverly titled Phil Ferguson Show. This is episode 204. Quite a handful of things to go over today. The first one I have is that someone had asked me to look into a specific fund, and apparently they did not realize that this was a hedge fund. Now, regular listeners will know that I'm not very keen on the idea of hedge funds in general, but this was being touted by the financial guru wannabe Tony Robbins, who's very famous, makes way more money than I'll ever make, so he's doing something right. Maybe it's just shameless self-promotion. But it goes off this idea, and it also, the fund itself is created by what they call the hedge fund king, Ray Dalio, and it's called the All-Weather Fund. And the idea is that no matter what happens, market goes up, market goes down, this portfolio in the long run makes the most money. And some of the selling points is that in 75 years of history, the single biggest loss that this has ever had is 3.95%. And from 1984 to 2013, it's made about 10% a year. So it's made close to what the market's made and hardly ever loses money. And if you look back way long periods of time, it does pretty well too. So there's some cherry picking going on here. So the first thing, I'm going to talk about what the all-weather portfolio is. It's 30% stock, 7.5% commodities, which I do not use, 7.5% gold, I definitely do not use, 40% long-term U.S. bonds, which I am very earnestly warning against using today, 2017, and 15% intermediate-term bonds, which I'm also not real happy with. It doesn't even have exposure really to international. So there's a lot of things that I disagree with philosophically, but you know what? If it works, it works. Unfortunately, this is something that is a formula that they created to go backwards in time. We've talked about backtesting data, and that can be a little dicey, but it's called the all-weather portfolio. And it's interesting when they give this information, they talk about how well it's done from 1984 to 2013. And I wonder why that is. Could it be that perhaps since 2013 it's underperformed? Well, let's take a look. I found a nice article in Forbes.com online, so you can go look it up. It is called Hedge Fund King Ray Dalio's All-Weather Fund. Then it continues with the title, but I don't want to spoil the results. So let's look at 2013. 2013, this fund, unfortunately, did lose 4% after fees and expenses. So, I mean, that's what you really get to take home is that 4%. So the question is, how did the U.S. stock market do? It went up 32.4%. So minus 4 versus 32.4. So it underperformed the market by 36% in one calendar year. Now, the funny thing is that the Forbes article says that the fund rebounded in 2014, making 8.6, which, you know, compared to minus 4, returning 8.6 does sound like quite a nice improvement. Unfortunately, in 2014, the market was up 13.7, well, at least the S&P 500, 13.7%. So again, considerably 5 points, 5 points behind the market. The other thing, then, of course, we have the 2015 data. The market as a whole, or at least the S&P 500, forgive me, made 1.4%, not a big up year, but at least it wasn't negative. And this hedge fund lost 7%. So over the last 3 years, it's done horrifically bad. And again, this is an example of looking backwards in time for, in this case, 60, 70 years and saying, if I do this one thing this one way for 70 years, it's going to produce great results. Well, one of the big things that made this work really, really, really well between 1984 and 2013 is that long-term and intermediate term, but mostly long-term U.S. government bonds not only paid a really high interest rate starting in 1984. You could make 7, 8, 9% in long-term government bonds. But since then, that rate has continually fallen year after year after year. And as rates fall, the older bonds that paid a higher rate become more valuable. So if you buy a $100,000 bond that pays 8%, and then next year the best bond you can get for $100,000 pays 7%, which would you rather make every year? $8,000 or $7,000? I mean, it's a really simplistic question, but it gets to the valuation of bonds. So if I can only make 7% in this second year of this example, the one that pays 8% is now more valuable, and people will bid up the price by 5, 8, 10, 12% so that it effectively yields again 7%. So if you owned it and then sold it, not only did you get 8% for the first year, but you might have made 10% or 12% in the second year selling it. So when you buy long-term bonds, especially really high-quality U.S. government long-term bonds, they're very sensitive to interest rate fluctuations. So when interest rates fall, you can make a lot of money in long-term bonds, especially when it starts at 8%, because not only are you making the 8%, but your bonds increase in value. So you can do really, really well. And that's one of the keys to this portfolio is during that time, all the way up until about 6 to 12 months ago, long-term bond rates had been falling. But there's really not much room left for them to fall. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they go from 3.5% to 3%. But I think now it's far more likely that long-term rates are going to go up. And we've seen this, and I'm seeing it personally for myself. If I had bought my new home 6 months ago, I might have been able to get under 4%. Now I'm delighted to get under 4.5%. And a year from now, it could be 5 or 5.5%. And so the reverse is true on these bonds. If they go up, if interest rates go up 1%, and instead of owning a 3% bond, I can now buy a 4% bond. I don't want your 3% bond. Would I rather make $3,000 or $4,000? I want $4,000. So, yes, this did well as a long-term strategy over the years, but during the last 3 years, after a lot of people threw money into it, it went kaput. And of course, because it's in a hedge fund, it also has the 2 and 20, 2% management fee plus 20% of your gains. So, very, very expensive hedge fund. So that's just another example of something that we can look at. The other interesting thing that just came up for me this week is a story about a fund that closed. I mean, when I say closed, it just kind of stopped doing business. Let me explain. So one of my clients had a fund that we found out we could not sell. So my clients end up having their accounts set up at TD Ameritrade because you don't want Phil to hold the money. TD Ameritrade holds the money. They're the custodian. But this fund, it is called the Third Avenue Focused Credit Fund. Okay, that's nice. A lot of fancy words there. What does focused credit mean? Third Avenue is the name of the company. Well, it turns out, unbeknownst to my client, a listener of the show, so if you're listening, hello. It was kind of funny when I told him, when we learned this, I said, you just created a new show topic for me. He was surprisingly excited to be a show topic. So he will know who he is. I'm not going to say his name, but he had an advisor, and the advisor bought this fund for him. And one of the things that is a constant problem in this industry is that 94 to 95% of advisors are paid commissions. They make more money by selling. They don't make anything more by knowing what they're doing. So they recommended this fund because it had really high dividends. And this is something I see on a regular basis today. If you have a portfolio that has a bond fund that is making anything in excess of 5%, you should be very, very concerned, because how are they doing that? There's only a couple of ways they can do that. One is they buy all kinds of long-term bonds. Two, they buy really risky bonds, or they buy international bonds. Now, if you want a portion of your portfolio to be junk bonds, and you know that you're getting a portion of your portfolio that's junk bonds, not a problem. Last year, the Vanguard Junk Bond Index Fund made 12%. So it's another asset class that can go up and down at different times than stocks. Nothing wrong with it. Another way to make some money is emerging market bonds. You're not subject to U.S. interest rate fluctuations, and you're not really subject too much to international interest rate fluctuations, because these are in emerging market countries where rates probably are not really low like they are in the United States or Germany or Great Britain. And so these bonds pay a little bit more, but there are risks involved. Well, this fund was a junk bond fund straight up, and it was the junkiest of junk bonds. So let me give you a quick little tutorial on bond ratings. There are three main systems for rating bonds, or three main companies. One is Moody's, the other one is S&P, Standard & Poor's, and the other one is Fitch. They have very similar ratings, but they tweak out and use a couple different letters. So if you want to see more about this or read up on this, you can, of course, go to Wikipedia, and I found it under bond credit rating. So AAA bonds, those are usually reserved for U.S. government bonds. Now, if Google or Apple or some other company that had a mountain of cash issued bonds, they might also be AAA, but they're probably going to be some kind of AA plus, really, really high-grade bonds. And then you get down to single A. And, of course, the single A can be further modified with A plus or A minus, just like your grades. And then, of course, you get to triple B plus and triple B and triple B minus. And then we get to double B. And anything double B or below is considered to be not prime, also non-investment grade. And then when you get down to single B, they're called speculative or highly speculative. So generally, a junk bond fund, a quality junk bond fund, will try to be around an average rating of double B. They might buy some things that are triple B that are a little bit better, but the yield will be lower, and they'll buy some things that are single B or worse because they'll tend to pay higher rates. And so they have to do all this shopping and buying these bonds. And by the way, this is something you should not consider doing on your own. If you have a broker and they're advising you to buy individual issues of bonds, don't do it. It's a very, very complicated world, and I don't even understand it. So don't do that. But if you want a junk bond fund, that's fine, and it should be in around that double B range. And below double B, of course, is single B. And then we have triple C, which is considered to be, I love this, the way it's described on the Wikipedia page, substantial risk, extreme risk, and then when you get to triple C minus or double C, it says default imminent. So this fund that my client had, this Third Avenue focused credit fund, it had every single bond in its portfolio was triple C or worse. And by worse, a lot of the bonds weren't even rated because they knew they'd get such a bad rating that they thought it might be better in their own best interest to not even be rated. Like, this film has not yet been rated because they don't want the rating. So some bonds, they understand that the bonds are so risky, they don't bother to get a rating. So in this case, these bonds were doing very poorly. And what happens is this fund made money for several years, but then it didn't. And so what happened in December of 2015, the fund closed. It ceased. You couldn't put money in and you couldn't take money out. And what happened was that this fund started to experience a run, like a run on a bank. Or if you remember, if you've seen the movie The Big Short, one of the main characters in the movie, he sent out an email to all of his investors that they can no longer pull the money out. And this is actually quite a reasonable and rational thing to do from the mutual fund's perspective, is that if their investments are underwater or performing poorly and people pull out their money, that money has to come from somewhere. It's one of the problems with a lot of mutual funds. They'll keep 5 or 10 or 15% cash on hand when people want to take money out or waiting for a dip to buy something on a special price. But that tends to create a drag in your portfolio. Index funds, and particularly Vanguard index funds, usually keep the cash percentage of the funds incredibly low. So when that cash reserve is used up, you have to start selling something. And if the market's up, you can sell at a profit. But who takes their money out when the market's up? Most people take money out when the market goes down, contrary to the incredibly basic advice of buy low and sell high. Most humans, or a lot of people, do the exact opposite of the really, really simplistic advice. So when this fund started to dramatically underperform, people started taking their money out. So the mutual fund closed, and it stopped running for business. And it said, we will just pay you out over time as we can liquidate our investments at a reasonable pace. And back in 2013, 2014, this fund went from between $10 to $12 a share. And after it closed, no surprise, it fell to under $8. And as of today, it is $4.13. So if you bought this at its peak of 12, you've now lost 75% of your money. So this can happen. And the big part of this is understanding the credit rating of the bonds in your bond fund. So like I said, if you have a bond fund paying more than 5% dividend or yield, you need to know why. How are they doing that? What kind of magic are they employing? Because it's really hard to do today. You have to take on some kind of risk. If you're okay with that risk, that's fine. But when I see someone who is in retirement or near retirement and has 30, 40, 50% of their portfolio in bonds, but they have 6 different bond funds from 6 different companies, and all 6 of them are paying 5, 6, 7, 8%, and I explain to them that virtually all of the bonds that they own are high yield or junk and high risk, they're stunned to find out that almost half of their portfolio is crap. And so the idea of having the cushion protect you, if these things are in your cushion, if these are the things that you expect to protect you if the market goes down, there's a really good chance they're not going to. So if we have an event like 2008 and the U.S. stock market falls 37% in one calendar year, these bond funds are not going to do well. They're going to do quite badly. And I'm not saying they'll lose 37%, but 10, 15, 25, 30% wouldn't surprise me. If that's the part of your portfolio that you're expecting to keep you safe, you now, of course, have a serious problem. And so this leads into another question someone sent me via email. And it was basically, what do I use in the cushion? Because they're looking around and they're not seeing many good options. Well, they're right. There aren't a whole lot of good options. So some of the funds that I use, and I'm using Vanguard index funds. Regular listeners won't be surprised, but the Vanguard short-term bond index, and of course you can get government bonds or corporate bonds. And right now the yield on those is 1.5, 1.6, maybe 1.9 for the corporate one. Not very good. Vanguard also has intermediate and long-term bonds. Not real eager to invest in those at this point in time. And matter of fact, I stand by my standing position that if you own them, you should be taking money out and or selling them. Please, of course, consider your tax consequences before doing something like that. And another thing that's very common, very popular at Vanguard is the total bond fund, which for most years, it's absolutely fantastic, but it has a generous portion of intermediate and long-term bonds. Its duration is over 6. my recommendation is to try to stay under 5. So it's a little bit on the riskier side. So if a duration is 6, if interest rates go up 1 point, which could happen in the next 12 years, if it's paying a 3% dividend, you get the 3% dividend, and then you lose 6% in the value of the fund. So you could lose 3%. Not a huge loss, but making 2% looks way better than losing 3. I mean, that's a big deal. Another thing that I do use is the Vanguard High Yield Corporate, a.k.a. Junk Bond Fund. Again, these are some of the better rated junk bonds. It has about 60% of its bonds are triple B or better. Now, they also have double B and single B fund bonds, and they even have a little bit of triple C. Now, they may not have bought in triple C. Those bonds may have been downgraded after their ownership, but their exposure to triple C and unrated is below 6%. So the bulk of the bonds are higher rated junk bond funds, and that's why this fund can give you a little bit higher return. The current yield on that is 4.74%. So it's getting up towards that 5%, and it might do quite well. It might lose money. Fingers crossed. It's not subject to losing 75% of its value by being in incredibly risky bonds. So that's one thing that you can use. That's the Vanguard High Yield Bond Fund. And there's 2 other funds that I use. One is the Vanguard Emerging Markets Bond Fund. We talked about that a little bit before. Again, its duration is 6.1, which is above my 5-year limit, or my duration of 5 limit, but it's not U.S. based. So, and part of it's not as sensitive to interest rates because it has higher yields, and like I said, that's 4.5% right now. So again, you are taking on some international risk. One thing that you must make sure if you have any kind of international bonds is that they are adjusted for currency fluctuations. I happen to know that Vanguard does that every single day, and the reason that's important is that if the dollar goes up by 15% in strength compared to the rest of the world in a calendar year, if your fund pays a 5% dividend, but it now got marked down by 15%, you just lost 10%, even though the investment actually made money. So then you're doing much more of a currency arbitrage than investing in international bonds. So again, you need to understand what you own and why. And of course, the last thing is Ginnie Maes. And Ginnie Maes are mortgage-backed securities. And they have a long history of doing pretty well, 5-6%. And they respond to interest rates a little different because as their interest rates start going up, and I think that's the era that we're going to be in for a while, most people don't go out and refinance their home. So these will eventually react to interest rate fluctuations, but nowhere near as quickly. So you have a little time to wait that out. Anyway, way more than I actually intended to cover, so hopefully that was beneficial to you and educational about how some of those things work. We're going to do a little break, and when we come back, we're going to talk to Barry Lynn.
The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Our contemplations of the cosmos stir us. There's a tingling in the spine, a catch in the voice, a faint sensation as if a distant memory of falling from a great height. We know we are approaching the grandest of mysteries. The size and age of the cosmos are beyond ordinary human understanding. Lost somewhere between immensity and eternity is our tiny planetary home, the Earth. For the first time, we have the power to decide the fate of our planet and ourselves. This is a time of great danger, but our species is young and curious and brave, It shows much promise. In the last few millennia, we have made the most astonishing and unexpected discoveries about the cosmos and our place within it. I believe our future depends powerfully on how well we understand this cosmos in which we float like a mote of dust in the morning sky. We wish to pursue the truth no matter where it leads. But to find the truth, we need imagination and skepticism both. We will not be afraid to speculate, but we will be careful to distinguish speculation from fact. The cosmos is full beyond measure of elegant truths, of exquisite interrelationships, of the awesome machinery of nature. The surface of the Earth is the shore of the cosmic ocean. On this shore, we've learned most of what we know. Recently, we've waded a little way out, maybe ankle deep, and the water seems inviting. Some part of our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return. And we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
All right, everybody, welcome back. This is Phil Ferguson, and of course, you are listening to the cleverly titled Phil Ferguson Show. With me today, I have Barry Lynn from the organization called Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. How are you, sir?
I'm doing just fine, even though living in Washington these days is a traumatic experience.
Well, I think it was an ancient proverb that says, "May one, be blessed to live in boring times," or something like that.
Yeah, it may have been Charles Dickens who actually wrote that. I'm not sure, but it's a good saying for any time. But this is a peculiar time because I'm almost 68 years. I am 68 years old, and never in all the time that I've spent in Washington, not with Nixon, Reagan, George W. Bush, has anyone conducted himself in the way that President Donald Trump has done it. He's an extraordinarily active person. He did, in fact, do a lot of the things, albeit poorly, that he claimed he would do. And I think that the country's gradually waking up to the fact that he's going to do what he said he would do, and that some of us really aren't fans of that.
Well, you are a dreamer that he will behave and continue to do everything, but hopefully something happens. Someone comes to their senses. Congress flexes a muscle or something, but it is a pretty amazing time.
No, I mean, obviously there should be and there can be a legitimate, loyal opposition. And the Democrats and the two independent senators and the sensible Republican senators, two of whom voted against Betsy DeVos as the Department of Education head, it shows that you can make a difference, that there is something that is possible, but you have to have the spine and be willing to do it. And it remains to be seen, frankly, about how rigid that spine will be as we get to some of the most contentious issues that are likely to come up this year.
Well, I have a laundry list of dozens and dozens of things we could talk about, but since you mentioned one of them already, Mrs. Voss, DeVos.
Yes.
I know that Americans United officially has no political position. It's an issue-driven organization, but what are your thoughts about her specifically that made her a problem?
I mean, one of the things that we are able to do under our tax-exempt status, as anyone else, is to take positions on these nominees, and we did formally oppose Betsy DeVos. Betsy DeVos does not know anything about public schools, yet she is running a Department of Education whose primary interest has been and ought to continue to be public education. She's trashed public schools. She's used all kinds of old arguments about why it doesn't work. And most of her professional career has been devoted to finding ways to finance private education and religious education in those private schools. I think she made an enormous blunder just last week, one day after she was formally appointed to this job after a tie vote in the Senate broken by Vice President Mike Pence, who's also a big supporter of school choice, as he calls it. And, she wrote a tweet the next day that started out saying, I'm having a great time in my first day. Where do I find the pencils? And it's so arrogant and stupid because here is a woman who doesn't seem to understand that there are public school teachers, many of whom I know, who get their pencils for their students by paying for them out of their own pocket. There aren't even enough funds available in many public schools to buy art supplies, to buy pencils. And in some schools, including those in parts of Philadelphia, you have to share textbooks. This is not the way to guarantee a quality public school education to everyone and every child that wants it and deserves it. And we are better off making a commitment to public schools open to everyone than diverting any money. Donald Trump wants to divert $20 billion this year away from public schools into private schools and into home schools. And that's a horrendously bad idea, in my view.
Well, I think it modifying an old saying, 20 billion here, 20 billion there, eventually it adds up to something.
That's right. That was Everett Dirksen. You're quoting all these things, and I just happen to know. Like if you quoted something from the Lego Batman movie, my wife and I just saw that yesterday. It's so clever. But if you haven't seen it, or your listeners haven't seen it, even if you're almost 70 years old, you go see it. Because you're going to love it.
Well, I know that my wife and I saw the Lego movie, and
yes,
we were delightfully surprised. And it's one of those things that, yes, it's animation, but there must be a ginormous crew of writers to come up with not only a wonderful, heart-touching story, but humor that is for all ages, not just for kids. That makes the parents want to see it.
Oh, no, it's very funny for anybody who's lived through the 1980s, for example. There's so many references to the movies and the music of that time, and it's just a very clever thing. So those of us, who were raising children in that period, we remember all of it, and it really is I'd give it an A. Solid A.
You're giving it
on
a thumbs
some
up
kind of score.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because when I used to DJ weddings and anniversaries and class reunions, one of the rules of thumbs that I used was when people were around 18 to 20, that's the music you want to play. So if it's a 20-year high school reunion, you play music from 20 years ago. Following that same philosophy, most people have children in their mid to late 20s, or at least they have kids old enough to go see a film like this. And so that puts it right in the heart of the 80s. So you have all this music that appeals to the parents. And without seeing the movie, I'm assuming there's a couple of contemporary songs that might be more for the younger crowd. But that's very, very smart planning on them. It's not by accident.
Oh, no, very little in Hollywood is by accident, and I'm sure this isn't, but it's, let me put it this way, just the soundtrack to that, in my judgment, was a lot better than the soundtrack to the Grammys last night.
Oh, well, there used to be an old philosophy that the better the soundtrack for a movie, the worse the movie. Like back in the day, Bodyguard or something like that had just a New Jack City, these amazing soundtracks. But sticking to education,
yes.
it also, Donald Trump apparently is anointing, if I can use that phrase, Jerry Falwell Jr. to be on an education task force to figure out how to fix, a.k.a. break, our educational system. What do you think about that?
No, I think Jerry Falwell Jr. has been a real contributor to a lot of disinformation on the part of President Trump and candidate Trump. This is, of course, Liberty University. Jerry Jr., as he's affectionately called, is was an early supporter of Donald Trump. Donald Trump gave that famous address there just a week or so before the Iowa primaries, in which he cited the well-known book of the Bible, 2 Corinthians, which actually sounded like the beginning of a joke, like 2 Corinthians and an Ephesian walk into a bar.
Yeah. Well, are there still Corinthians around?
Well, go to Corinth and you'll find out. No, there must be Corinthians. There are people who are proud to be almost anything. Donald Trump is proud to be president. There must be people in Corinth who are happy to be Corinthians. So I don't know about the Galatians. I'm not sure about what happened to them.
So I know that education is a bit of a problem. We also have Trump appointments. Not that I plan to talk about Trump all day, but what can one do? I mean, we can't keep up. But the Muslim ban now, Americans United for the Separation of Church and State is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it is a secular organization in that it doesn't take a position pro or against religion. And matter of fact, if I remember correctly, you are a minister. Is that?
I am. I'm a minister in the United Church of Christ. I'm also an attorney, and we have a great diversity of beliefs on the staff and among our board members and others. So we're secular in the sense that we do believe the government has no business getting into the theology business. We take no position on the existence of God and the reason, or there's a purpose to the universe. We don't. That's not our thing. But I like to say, particularly when speaking to atheist conventions, that I always say I am a theist, but I don't want to argue about that because we've been arguing about that for 2,000 years. What I'd like to do is just figure out how to save the First Amendment to the Constitution, those glorious 16 words, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's what we should all agree about, whether we're theists or non-theists. We ought to work together, and we ought to make sure that organizations thrive that are promoting those principles. And that's what Americans United for Separation of Church and State has been doing since its founding in 1948, which if anybody's taking notes, you might say, well, that's the year you were born. But I wasn't coming out of the womb supporting separation of church and state. It just happens that I was born the same year this organization was founded.
That is great fun. Now, I happen to be talking to a conservative friend of mine who has bought into the alternative facts. And their position was, why is it so wrong to block refugees for 90 days from entering the country? And I said, first of all, I wouldn't use the word block. That's too soft. It's a ban, sure. And it's on immigrants. And his response was, immigrants, refugees, same thing. And someone who is escaping a war-torn country is likely to be a refugee. Someone who is an immigrant is someone who has probably already gone through all of the legal proceedings and establishments set up by the United States government and has legal permission, whether it's a green card or a visa, and they're here legally. We prevented those people from... I mean, we broke our own laws in my mind, and is that kind of something that's part of your position?
No, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that this is a specific Muslim ban. That is to say, the only countries that are affected by this are those that are predominantly Muslim. And then, of course, people in the government say, well, but if it was a Muslim ban, we'd ban everybody from every predominantly Muslim country. And look, we're leaving some off the list. And I think that's nonsense. I think there are people, progressive political people, who rightly point out that some of the predominantly Muslim countries that have been left off this ban list are ones in which the president is doing business and would love to continue that, possibly now and certainly after he leaves office. But the other thing is that it's clear that there's a religious preference involved here. If you're a minority religion from those countries, you are expected to be given a special privilege to come to the United States. And of course, in predominantly Muslim countries, the minority religion is Christian. So it's a double whammy of problems devoted to discrimination against and favoritism in favor of a majority religion in this country, Christianity. And that's not the way we're supposed to make laws. We're not supposed to make judgments in this country based on theology. We're not supposed to do proof texting from the Bible in order to determine what the policies of the country are. I do have a book here on my shelf. It's nearly 450 pages long. It's called Politics According to the Bible, and its author, a professor at a conservative seminary named Wayne Grudem, claims that there's a Bible answer to every single issue, including such issues, obvious issues to those on the religious right, abortion, contraception, marriage equality, and then but also, what military aircraft, what fighter planes the Department of Defense ought to purchase in its next round of buying. Now, in case listeners are interested, it's the F-16 Raptor that they're supposed to be buying.
Is that because it's 16, or is that because of the word raptor? Because raptor probably is not in the Bible, where 16 probably is.
Yeah, I think 16 is, and Raptor isn't, but there are a lot of raptors in those Jurassic Park movies.
Well, according to Ken Ham, there were dinosaurs on the boat.
Look, according to Ken Ham, there were not only dinosaurs, but there were also unicorns. I pointed that out one night when Ken Ham and I were on Anderson Cooper, and Anderson Cooper first, I'd said the dinosaur is going to be on this ark, and he said to Ken Ham, well, is that true? And Ken goes, well, of course. I mean, the Earth's 6,000 years old, and so we could have humans and dinosaurs at the same time. And then I said, but there are also unicorns. Anderson says to Ken, well, is that true too? And Ken was a little bit, we say, a little off on that. He wasn't sure he wanted to commit, but he basically said yes. And I did have to point out that unicorns are fictional beasts. And when I walked out of the studio that night, there was a woman producer out there, and she said, Barry, I can't believe you've said this. I said, what? She said that there are no unicorns. You have crushed the dreams of millions of little girls.
Now, why are the little girls? Can't little boys think about unicorns? Or are they limited to Pegasi?
I mean, it's a stereotype, but I mean, I'm just repeating what was said. My own daughter was a big fan of unicorns in her day, and I got her. I remember renting a movie called The Last Unicorn, a cartoon, and she wouldn't let me take it back to the video store because she wanted to watch it over and over and over again.
Yeah, kids are like that. That's kind of cute, and then they grow out of it and get into all kinds of trouble.
Not my daughter. She didn't get into any trouble. But she's a lawyer now, so maybe she did get in trouble. I don't know.
There you go. We'll just leave it at that. Another thing, of course, sticking to the topic of Trump, sadly, he is apparently implying, maybe he's going to make an executive order that ministers can say whatever they want about politics from the pulpit. What are your thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, well, actually, this is one of the things that Jerry Falwell Jr. Convinced him that the clergy in this country have no real pulpit freedom. They can't say anything. And that's not true. They can say anything. You can even talk about politics. You can talk about why you're pro-choice, pro-life, pro-this, pro-that, anti-this, anti-that. The only thing you can't do is endorse or oppose a candidate for public office. And Lyndon Johnson, this is the so-called Johnson Amendment that Trump talks about on a regular basis. 1954, he puts this in the tax code because Lyndon Johnson was quite disturbed that there was a religious foundation in Texas that was collecting a large amount of charitable money and using virtually all of it to defeat him in his run for the United States Senate. So you can understand people would be disturbed. Politicians would be disturbed if they thought that charities were, in fact, promoting their candidacy this year and then might change their mind the next year. It's total fraud. Pulpit freedom is so much a part of what this country does. And the only thing that the church, the synagogue, the mosque, the temple cannot do is endorse or oppose a candidate. They can't use money collected for religious purposes to support candidates. And I think that's a great thing. And I think most ministers in this country, when they're polled, do not want to get into the business of endorsing candidates. They don't want cigar smoke to come wafting up from the church basement while people are figuring out where they could dump half of the Sunday income to go to somebody's campaign. The other thing about churches, Phil, as you know, churches are treated very differently and very favorably under the tax laws right now. For example, if you and I set up a church, first of all, we don't even have to apply to be tax exempt. The mere fact that we have the Barry and Phil Church is enough to get us tax exemption. And then when it comes to the end of the year, we don't have to file the same kinds of reports that I do at Americans United for Separation of Church and State that, among other things, detail where my money is coming from and where it's going. Not every contribution, but just major contributors and major expenditures. Churches don't have to do that. And that's why these mega churches that drive people crazy, they collect huge amounts of money. They provide for multiple palatial homes for some of these mega church ministers who are on television, and they don't have to tell anybody what they're doing, where they're spending their money. And that's annoying even to people who are in those congregations when they find out that there's no way they can learn what the pastor is making and what he's spending it on.
Is that called the parish exemption?
That's it's even broader, because there's not only can you have do you not have to report your church's income, but you also have an exemption for a parsonage allowance. In other words, let's say that I've never taken this, but let's say that I was pastoring a church and somebody said, well, we're not going to pay you as much, but we're going to give you a wonderful house. And then I wouldn't even have to report the value of that rental on my own personal taxes. And that's disturbing to a lot of people as well.
Now, I don't know if you knew this. I spent 5 years pretending to be a Missouri Lutheran member, Missouri Lutheran Synod. And they had a thing there that anyone that was called by the Spirit to work for the church or the school, because the school teachers were there to indoctrinate and to preach to the children.
Sure.
The teachers could claim they were limited by law, apparently, up to 100% of their income as a parsonage exemption themselves, because they were called to be an employee.
Yes, that is very much the case. It's all up to the person to decide how much of the value is to be considered a parsonage allowance. And it's one of the things, and maybe I want to try this on your conservative friend you mentioned earlier. Every time somebody does not pay taxes, somebody else, perhaps you and myself and your conservative friend, are paying more taxes. So if you just look at this economically, when you see this vast amount of money coming into somebody's ministry, there's a fellow in Georgia who famously went out seeking, I think, $30 million for a new jet airplane. He had one, but he wanted to update it. When you hear about that and you realize there's not a penny going into the coffers of the government in Georgia or the United States for that kind of expenditure, somebody else is paying for it, and that ought to tick a lot of people off.
Well, I know I have a real-world example from my personal experience. I used to live in a small town outside of Champaign-Urbana, and there was a couple hundred acres of land that was kind of slotted by the city to be the next place of development, where the next 500 to 1,000 houses would go over the next several decades. And because that was known to be the ideal place to build more houses, of course, it wasn't $2,000 an acre land. It was $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 acre land. And when the owner of that land passed away, he donated it to a church.
Yeah.
And the church now pays taxes on the crops that come in if they make a profit. However, they pay no property tax on the land, and that city suddenly, overnight, was thrown into a financial distress situation because a very big chunk of their annual income disappeared overnight. And so they had to either cut some services or, like you said, literally charge everyone else in the city more tax money because the church took that land off the tax rolls.
No, I mean, and that's something that's replicated in a lot of communities around the United States, all over the place. One of the things is that if you have, and I think this is probably why they're able to charge some taxes for the crops themselves, if it's unrelated business income, in other words, it's not related to the promotion of the faith, whatever that faith is, you may have to pay taxes on it. I remember when I was back in the day when I was with the ACLU for many years, there was an intervention in a case in New Jersey where a church owned a canning factory, and they tried to get tax exemption for that. And luckily the court said, no, we don't understand how canning vegetables happens to have anything to do with promoting the faith. And so they did restrict it, and that may be what's going on back in Champaign.
Yeah, I know that was the case with the crops, but of course there have been stories where churches, open up gift shops and restaurants and side businesses, and some of them are very upfront about it and pay the tax without any questions asked. And then there's others that go along for years, if not decades, until someone reports them, and then and only then someone at the IRS goes, well, all right, we're going to have to charge you now.
No, absolutely. And, back in the days when the television evangelists were so big, so popular, Jimmy Swaggart of Jimmy Swaggart Ministries tried to claim that the sale of his books could not be taxed because they were religious books. And the tax people said, no, wait a minute. Actually, it's just a book. We charge tax for everybody else's book. We have to charge it for yours. He took that all the way to the Supreme Court and lost. So when people say, well, tax exemption for churches, why, that's guaranteed by the Constitution. It's not. The most that the Constitution says is that if you give a tax exemption to a broad range of organizations, you can include churches within it because they have a purpose of some kind of community betterment as they understand it. And that's the other side of the coin. But, I mean, this is ridiculous to think that you get a special privilege in addition to the literally hundreds of special privileges given to churches and other religious institutions under federal law right now. Some of them are important, perhaps. You could make an argument that they don't hurt anyone else. But most of them are just the power of the church lobby to get out of doing those things which other people have to do or face fines or, in rare cases, imprisonment for doing. And this is the other thing Donald Trump wants to do. He has made it clear that he believes that if you have a religious objection to a law, you should be able to essentially say, well, I'm not going to abide by that law. This grows out of what, again, Jerry Falwell Jr. and others have told him, and is also based on a decision called Hobby Lobby from a few years ago where the Supreme Court said that Hobby Lobby had the right to fail to include contraceptive coverage in its insurance plan under the Affordable Care Act. And Hobby Lobby said, well, wait a minute, we're not a religious organization, but our board of directors, they're very religious and they don't believe in certain kinds of contraception, and we're not going to cover that for our employees. So tens of thousands of women employees around the country lost their ability to get contraceptive coverage from Hobby Lobby, and the same thing is now facing the court once it ever gets the ninth member. And I just as soon. This is an old TV show. 8 is enough. I think we're finding that it is enough. We don't need, but the the issue here is, if let's say you have a religiously affiliated college or university like Notre Dame. We at Americans United for Separation of Church and State are the only people that actually intervened in a case on behalf of actual people, some women students at Notre Dame. And our argument was, and I think the voices of these women were extremely important in so far winning a case. All Notre Dame had to do, and all these religiously affiliated places had to do, was just sign a statement that said, look, we don't approve of contraception, and we're not covering it in any kind of insurance plan for our students, for our employees. And then under the Affordable Care Act, which is Obamacare, I realize it's a big study last week that said, people don't know that they're the same thing. The Affordable Care Act, it would basically permit the government, in fact, require the government to go to an insurance company and say, well, you have to provide free coverage to those students or to those employees who are not able to obtain it from their religiously affiliated organization. So Notre Dame, which gets, just to be technical, I think a gazillion dollars from the federal government for all kinds of grants and scholarships and programs. But in this case, they said just to sign a letter, just to write a note that says we can in good conscience cover contraceptives itself would violate their religious principles. So now we have this weird situation, Phil, where to declare a conscientious objection to something would itself violate the purported religious beliefs of that entity, of that university or that hospital. And that's an absurd conclusion. We hope that that would get resolved about 8 months ago, and it didn't. There was a 4-4 split on the Supreme Court on that question. So it remains in limbo, awaiting perhaps a ninth member to split the difference or to decide that it is a violation of your conscience to declare that you have a conscience about something you won't do.
Well, and I would go a step further, and you probably would agree with me that even that that loophole for these religious organizations is inappropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I do remember giving a speech at the Feminist Majority Conference the year that this was percolating, and I said, they're going to come up with a compromise that'll sound normal to normal people, but some of these far-right religious entities are going to say, no, not good enough. And of course, tragically, I was correct, and so a lot of these universities simply won't do it. So it's a major issue. The president's been clear that he is not going to defend that provision of the Affordable Care Act, and in fact, they may look for even more legislative solutions that will guarantee that if you don't like something, you don't have to obey it as long as you have a religious objection to it. Two interesting things coming up. There are a couple of secular groups that are opposed to abortion. And, of course, these days, many forms of contraceptives are considered not by doctors but by cranky people in the religious right as abortifacients. They induce abortion. So this is not just a war on DNC procedures. This is a war also on the use of many forms of contraceptions, the ones that work, in other words.
Yeah, and it goes into this broader thing that women are going to have limitations on what they can do and not do with their body. And, of course, I'm opposed to that, and I know Americans United is. And if I can segue, we've talked a little bit about universities and even hinted at hospitals, and there's a new thing that kind of ties in with my business with finance, that some hospitals now may be able to not fully fund pensions or not have them at all. And what's the rationale behind that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting but somewhat arcane issue for a lot of people. But when you provide a plan and you're not a church, you are somehow related to a religious institution, to remove a pension plan or to suggest that you don't have to put any money into the pension plan has a dramatic negative effect on a lot of workers and a lot of employees. It's akin to what Reagan did back in the days when, I still run into people who say, well, I have a pension, and then they find out that 30 years ago the law was changed and their pension has been frozen or doesn't even exist anymore. And this would take a whole nother swipe at this, particularly for people related to somehow religiously affiliated hospitals. But most people go to hospitals. I try not to go there too often, but when I go, I'm trying to get healed. I'm trying to be fixed. I am not trying to engage in some kind of a theological enterprise with the doctors, the nurses, and the administrators. But that is the loophole that they're looking to use.
Yeah, it pops into my head a little story we had about a family member several years ago, and I think this may resonate extra with you being a minister. We were in a religiously affiliated hospital, and there's probably 30 people with the family in this giant waiting room, and the on-duty minister, priest, whatever, walks in, and he's got a clipboard, and he says, I'm looking for the so-and-so family, and we're all like, yeah, that's us, like everybody in this room. And he then simply says, so how's he doing? And there's this incredibly awkward pause, and then someone tells him that he's had it's some type of heart failure where you have water in the lungs and everything. And
congestive heart failure.
Yes, congestive. Thank you. Congestive heart failure, and his organs are failing, and he's hours from death. And this guy goes, "Oh, well, gosh, that doesn't sound good." I mean, either he didn't get that information or he didn't read that far. And he says, "Would you guys all like to pray about it?" And they're like, "No, please leave now."
Of course,
it was the most. I mean, I felt bad for him. It was that bizarre. How do you relate to that?
I mean, it's really one of the ironies. We are very clear that in a prison context, for example, you can't give special benefits to the ministry, people who are willing to go into something like the prison fellowship programs, which are pretty right-wing evangelical stuff. We had a big lawsuit in Iowa a few years ago where Chuck Colson's prison fellowship was basically allowed to run a huge section of an Iowa prison. And we had been contacted by some prisoners who were model prisoners. That is to say, they were ready to get out. Things had been going well. They were, to the extent that we can tell this, rehabilitated people. And they got kicked out of a wing of the prison because the Colson Prison Fellowship wannabe inmates to the program were moved into this highly desirable part of the prison. And how desirable was it? Well, you had double celling. You didn't have that. You didn't have that roommate in your prison cell. You could have your own cell. You could get a key to your cell. I don't spend much time in prisons either. Like hospitals, I try to avoid them. But I think it's good. If you have a key to your own cell at night, that's probably a good perk.
I can see that being a perk, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's not like they're giving you a car to get away from the prison when you leave. But the idea that somebody who simply says, I really want to get born again, is going to have preference over people who with a demonstrated capacity to be ideal prisoners was shocking. And we won that case, and I can't disclose how much we won, but we won a huge amount of money, and the state of Iowa had to, had to come up with that. We don't like to do that. I mean, we don't like to have to sue people. We sue under the Civil Rights Acts, which guarantee under some circumstances that if you're the prevailing private party, you at least get attorney's fees. And we've done that in a couple of cases. And one of the things that, going back to your business interest, we found that a lot of insurance lawyers are sometimes they have to crack down on things like local school boards. The school board says, well, we're going to have a prayer and then somebody objects, and then he goes to court, and they lose in the trial court, and they said this is established law. You can't have government-sponsored prayers in schools. And then they go, we're going to appeal it, and maybe they do appeal it to the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, and then they go, well, we lost there, but we're going all the way to the Supreme Court. And occasionally the insurance lawyers step in and say, if you're going on your own, because we're not obligated to take what is obviously a losing case and try to get it heard by the Supreme Court of the United States. So sometimes these, what I call a combination of economics, moral wisdom, and legal philosophy all culminate in not having something go yet another time to yet another level of the federal judiciary.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned money. How can people support Americans United?
Well, we have, I think, a wonderful website at www.au.org. www.au.org. You can tell we were early adopters of the internet because au.org is pretty big, pretty important. And we love to have contributions, financial and otherwise. We have many chapters all over the United States that people can get involved in. We have mailing lists and email lists, and we don't send, I don't know about you, but I get like 16 requests for money every day. They usually have some kind of heading like world ending, and then you can find out that you can help stop it from ending for a $3 contribution every day.
Right.
But we try to give you information. What's up? What's coming up? Who are the targeted members of the House or Senate to stop the worst things from happening? And I do think that in spite of the election results, that Americans have a great deal of power. They have the power to do the things we've seen happening in immigration, on women's rights, massive demonstrations followed up by the kind of organizing necessary to make members of Congress understand that there's a lot of people out there, including a lot of those people who voted for Hillary Clinton, who's I think now has 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did if you add up every person's vote. The popular vote, she wins. Because of the Electoral College, she loses. But a lot of those people are upset, and they really didn't think that Donald Trump would necessarily do all the things that he wants to do, but he has certainly started to demonstrate that he is completely convinced this is what he wants to do, and he has advisors of, Kellyanne Conway. I had to briefly, I knew her when she was Kellyanne Fitzpatrick when I first came to Washington, and Steve Bannon, and these are people with extreme viewpoints. They're people who will cover up anything. They're people who really believe that to talk about alternative realities as if they are things that are happening, that's okay. That's we should do that. We should definitely just make up stuff and then send somebody out on a talk show to confirm that the reality is just what the president said it was. This is not the way. This is not how Richard Nixon functioned, even though he was a liar in many ways. But he didn't do this, and neither did George Bush, and neither did Ronald Reagan. There was some test of kind of the boundaries of honesty that apparently President Trump sees no boundaries to those at all.
Well, I think that's a good way to wrap it up. Sadly, we started with Trump and we end with Trump.
Hey, look, John Oliver, he said he wasn't going to do Trump every night, but he was it was on last night and he this past weekend, and he did the whole show about, is Trump a pathological liar? And so comedians are having a lot of trouble these days because the things that they used to say were funny are now the things that Donald Trump and his close staff tells us is true, and it ain't so funny.
Yeah, it's not funny anymore. I mean, what else are you going to do? But in a large part of America, the best news that they get, the most reliable, most accurate, is Saturday Night Live. we're in a world of problems.
That's true. I have to say, I've always had mixed feelings about Alec Baldwin because of the certain things that he's said to his daughter and all these things. But I must say he has really become a brilliant satirist again. And those Sean Spicer things on Saturday Night Live, the press conferences, as Melissa McCarthy does them, are just pure gold. And I'm sure they disturb Donald Trump and Sean Spicer and maybe even Steve Bannon and Kellyanne Conway as much as they ought to.
Well, let's leave on that note of hope.
Okay, thanks, Phil.
Barry, thank you for being on the Phil Ferguson Show. Listeners, if you haven't already, go donate to Americans United from Separation of Church and State. And I've been a fan of the organization for about 12 years, if you didn't know.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's something I found. I had a job assignment years and years ago where I was stuck in the state of Arkansas with the internet and no one else around, and found Americans United. So it was a big part of motivating me to come out and fight the good fight for separation of church and state.
I thank you for that, Phil, and our tens of thousands of members around the country. It really makes a difference to have this kind of support. You can find it at au.org. Take a look at what we do, the projects that we're engaged in, and I think folks will learn a lot. We have a monthly magazine that comes out 11 times a year. There's a combined July-August issue, but it comes out, and it's the only place that it gets coverage because, frankly, the days of cable television being honest and having people like me on and somebody like a Jay Sekulow on are gone. They all have their hired guns. You see the same faces all the time. And to get out this kind of information, one goes to podcasts like yours, to the internet, and, of course, to our own magazine. If you want to know the truth about what's going on, we don't make up the truth. We just report it. Get a copy of our magazine. It comes with every membership.
Great. Well, Barry, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Phil.
Have a great day.
You too.
I want to thank you for listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. It is a unique combination of 1/3 finance and 2/3 atheism. The show is number one in that category. I want to promote the philosophy of science-based investing. Sadly, most advisors are paid commissions by a big company to sell you investments that underperform. Sometimes they make more money with your money than you do. I think the financial services industry is a lot like religion. They create fear. They provide a solution to that fear. They take your money, and they often get more benefit from it than you do. Remember, people work for who they are paid by. You want a fiduciary advisor that is paid only by you. If you have questions about investments, want to roll over an old 401k, or need to make a plan to build your very own everlasting nest egg, you may contact me, Phil, at PolarisFinancialPlanning.com. Together, we can protect children from religion, promote a secular worldview, fight the grip religion has on our society, and improve your financial future.
Never felt the slightest interest in the next world. I think it's here, and I think anything good that you're going to do, you should do for other people here, and not do anything to make yourself have a happy time in the next world, you know. No, I don't believe in religion. If you can live for other people away from yourself, you will be happy. And if you live for yourself, you will be unhappy, and you will then not be able to sleep or do anything else. After all, we have no notion as to what the next world is, if there is one. Mm-hmm. So there's no point in that. But it's always been, I hear a lot of people saying, well, I don't know the difference between good and bad. I know totally, for myself, the difference between right and wrong. Totally. Uh-huh. I know this because wrong makes me very uncomfortable and right makes me very happy. And I don't think it's so very difficult to know when you're doing the right thing and when you're doing the wrong thing. And I think each person, the right thing, the wrong thing varies.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
Well, of course, we're getting to that part of the show where we're going to wrap some things up. Just a quick reminder again, I will be in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and New Jersey, giving talks in late March and the first day or two of April 2017. So if you're in those areas, last episode I gave more details, and probably next week I'll do it again, where and when I'll be in the talks that I'm giving. It looks like most of the groups have either selected a skeptically investing talk, which is kind of a lot like my show, and we're going to give some hard-hitting mathematical explanations in a couple of investment products, or they have selected one of my older talks, which I used to only give a talk one time, but this was the first talk that people ask me to repeat again and again at their different conferences around the country. And it's called Breaking the Cycle, How to Get Kids Out of Religion. I've been advised that children is a better word, so sometimes I'll say how to get children out of religion. And it can be your own children, someone else's children, or your children's friends. So it's a talk filled with suggestions and ideas, some very casual, some very subtle, and some not subtle. How's that for you? One thing that I had intended to go over this show, or at least a new show, a current show, or maybe the next show, but now I don't know what to tell you, is an update about the fiduciary rule. And recently, the Department of Labor published a delightful 16-page PDF based on the information in the rule and how it's going to affect advisors and what you as a consumer should know. What are your rights? Why is there this rule? How does it work? And thankfully, I had downloaded and saved a copy of this PDF, but I went back just to double check that it hadn't changed on the Department of Labor website, and it's gone. So I went to the same link, and I can see the link in the search bar, or the address bar. Thank you. But the document is not there anymore. So it has been pulled down, like apparently a lot of things have by this administration. Things are changing. So I still don't know if in April, if the new fiduciary rule will go into place or not. So stay tuned. I hope that it sticks, but we will see. A couple quick reviews, and the only two places I know that have significant reviews, and if you know of another place, please email me, phil@polarisfinancialplanning.com, and I'll try to read some of them as well. But it is a huge benefit for the podcaster, in this case me, for you to do a review, because it makes the show have a higher ranking, and it allows people to know that this show is not just something brand new and they can go listen to it and maybe get something helpful. So a couple on iTunes, and I'll try to do these quickly, so forgive me. From Joe Zaberger, this is a great show. Everyone should listen to it. The only problem is that he does 2/3 atheism and 1/3 finance. We all already know that gods don't exist, but most of us have no clue how to money. He should flip that around and do 1/3 atheism and 2/3 finance. Well, thank you, Joe. It's a thought, but sometimes the finance segments take considerable work and effort, whereas the interviews of someone in the secular movement are fun and easy to do. So it may come down to a time thing. Plus, a lot of people, if I talk finance for an hour, they gloss over. And I know this to be true because I do it on the phone and in person all the time. And we're not trained generally to think about investing, which is, to your point, ironically, that we need to learn more. So thank you for the review. One from Patrick's wife. So Patrick's wife, thank you for that. Again, this is at iTunes. Let me explain. While the average person might enjoy the occasional talk on personal finance, I am surprised almost every week by how much I enjoy the financial portion of Phil's show. He always has great guests on to speak about atheist free thought or separation of church and state issues, but I expect to be bored by the financial talk. Instead, I stay interested for the entire podcast. Also, great interviews. That's the main reason I tune in, and Phil never disappoints. And so that was kind of the strategy, I guess, if I had a strategy. I want people to come and listen to the show, and while they're there, they get a little bit of investment advice and or information, knowledge. The other place that has reviews is Stitcher, and a lot of reviews there, but I need more. So if you listen on Stitcher, or even if you don't listen on Stitcher, if you'd be so kind to go and put in a review at Stitcher. The other thing that was amazing, Stitcher has a neat list, and I haven't found one similar anywhere else, that ranks religious, spiritual, and religious podcasts, which is hysterical because the top shows are The Scathing Atheist, The Thinking Atheist, The Atheist Experience. It is amusing. Dogma Debate, of course, with David Smalley is in the top 10. These shows are not religious or spiritual in what you might expect, but it's wonderful for us to see. And this list goes all the way down to, it's the top 100. And a few times I showed up in there, and then I started getting into the 50s and 60s, and I think 52 was the last I was before, and then it dropped a couple points. Well, this week, I'm 44. So the trend is positive. It keeps going up, and I am continually stunned. And thank you for listening, how many people do listen to the show. But there were a few reviews there, too, so I wanted to hit those here real quick. And I'm stalling because I ruined my sort. Here we go. From Renee, the comfort show for investing in atheism. I learn something every time I listen to a show and appreciate his efforts to combat religion because sometimes it feels like we are fighting for our freedoms in that department. I'm with you. And then one more from Robert. The show is only about, I can't read. The show is not only about fighting the damage caused by religion, pining for the hereafter, it is also full of practical information to help us heathens do the best we can financially in this life before we cast off to the underworld. So thank you both for that. And again, that's at Stitcher. And if you go listen at Stitcher or go comment at Stitcher, maybe the show can keep climbing up the rankings. I'm stunned at how well it's done in the short time we've been on. But like I said, I'm going to keep my eyes open on changes and updates to the fiduciary rule, and hopefully it goes into place. And I think the only thing worse than it not going into place is the current situation we have where we don't know if it's going into place. And that seems to be kind of the method of operation of the Trump administration. We don't really know if Muslims are banned. The rules change, and they change constantly and quickly, and maybe that's what they want. But save that for another show. Again, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Ciao.